Hey everyone, welcome to my next video, which is right back to basics. So I get asked all the time about how do I learn to draw something, or what's the best way that I can improve my skills, or what would you suggest I practice? So drawing is the linchpin of any artwork that you ever want to create. So if you can paint something really well and wield a paintbrush well, that's great. But if your drawing's a bit out of whack, the painting's always going to look just that little bit off. So learning to draw and practicing your skills of drawing is so important. What I have put together for this little demonstration are the most beautiful little pears that I found at the fruit and veggie shop the other day. So I've got a little selection of them set up in front of me now, which I will show you. And I'm just going to basically use some stuff that you probably have lying around the house, because if you're doing your social distancing part and you're not leaving the house, I don't want you to go and have to get a whole heap of art supplies, but most people are going to have some blank white paper, even if it's just out of the printer, no problem, and most people are going to have a bit of a lead pencil laying around the house. So my absolute favourite pencil to use is a 2B. Basically, think of it this way. H for hard, B for black is how I try and remember H versus B when it comes to the grades of lead in a pencil. So what that means is that HB is kind of halfway in the middle. It's half hard and half black. And then the B's are blacker the higher the number gets, if that makes any sense. So basically a 2B is my favorite because I can press nice and lightly and get some finer details, but I can press a bit harder and get some really nice dark shading if I have to. I do occasionally go up into 4s, 5s and 6s in the B range, but it has to be a pretty dark and gnarly drawing for me to go up into that height. If you have just H pencils, so a 2H or a 3H, you can work on sketching and some line work and a little bit of light shading, but you'll pretty much nearly rub a hole in your paper if you're trying to get the shading to go as dark as you want it to. So sometimes it's not your drawing skills that are letting you down, it might be the actual tool or the pencil that you've got. The other things I'm going to use are a paper stump. If you've never seen one of these before, it's literally like a little pencil, but it's made up of rolled paper. Now I've just quickly sharpened the end of this one, and I will show you once I get going on the drawing what I use it for, but rather than smudge anything with my finger, this is the tool that I use. I've got a mechanical pencil as well. Sometimes for drawing and sketching the original image, I use a mechanical pencil only because it's so fine and I don't have to sharpen it all the time, but I don't mind using a mechanical one occasionally. Obviously, trusty sharpener and an eraser. I also grabbed out of the studio, which I may have a play with this afternoon, or it may lead into my next video, but I grabbed some really nice little artist pencils, and these ones are actually quite pale in their tint, so they are a range of really nice sepia colours and greys as opposed to the really bright pinks, yellows, blues, greens, etc. So I'll see how I'm going for time today and see whether we include those. If not, I'll use them in my next session. So I'll stick a photo up in a second of the composition of the pears that I'm going to use. Actually, I might just turn the camera around now and I'll show you. So these are my 3 pears sitting over here, looking lovely and luscious. And my lighting in here, I've actually sat in the house today rather than out in the studio, but I really like that the lighting is strong enough from above and slightly to the side that it's casting a light source on each of the pears, and it's also casting a nice interesting shadow on the table. I did have a 4th pear over here, but I think I like the composition of just the 3 instead. I'm a bit of a odd numbers kind of girl, so I'm going to work with this as my inspiration picture, and then I'm going to get us going on the paper. So I'll relocate the camera so it's nice and stable and you can kind of watch over my shoulder and see what I'm doing, and we'll get into it. Okay, so I am right-handed, so my hand may cover some of the drawing while I'm going, but you'll get the general idea. So basically how I start when I look at any sort of drawing, and like I'm looking slightly down on these pears. So if I wanted a different angle, I might, put something up under them so that they were sitting exactly in front of my eye line, and then I'd be looking right side on at them. But because I'm going to be looking down at them slightly, it obviously changes the angle of how I will draw it, and it obviously changes the angle of how much shadow that I will see. So when I started drawing, literally I'm going to gently sketch in some shapes. Just kind of, where does that curve sit? Where does it straighten up? Now, the last thing I want to do when I draw is spend too long getting exactly that little stem perfect and then realizing it was too big for the actual image or the pear in itself. So first of all, anytime I start a drawing, it is a light sketch of where do all the elements in this picture sit? Have I got them relating to each other and talking to each other well enough? Then I will come back in and put the detail in. So I'm just avoiding this left-hand side of the paper because I've got a bit of dirt on it. But now for me, I can see that that second pear tucks in behind and it kind of meets it halfway. So if I look at the pears from the bottom of this left-hand pear to the middle, it's kind of where they cross over. So I'm always trying to break some drawing down mathematically and go, okay, if that was XYZ size, how big is this in relation? Then that pear doesn't have as much of a curvy side to it. Bit of a straighter top, straight down. And don't draw what you can't see. So this pear that's in front on the right-hand side blocks my view of the rest of this pear. So I wouldn't draw the bottom edge of that back pear in because I actually can't see it. But what happens is the direction that I'm looking at them from, this pear sits significantly further forward than the other two pears. So the bottom of this pear sits back a little, so it would be higher than the bottom of the pear on the left. And you can kind of see a little bit of that. So we just whack a little bit of a line in there. And then the bottom of this right-hand pear sits lower because it's showing that it's actually closer to us. So we put a little mark in where the bottom of this pear might be sitting. And obviously the pears are all the same size, roughly. So if the bottom is further down the page, the top would also need to be further down the page. No point me putting the top of this front pear up here, because then this pear would look like a giant and these two would look like tiny little peas next to it. So let's pop that curved edge in. Now this one has a bit of a flat edge to the top and a little bit more of a squared off corner. And then that lovely little pear shape kicks out at the bottom. And then I can come back in and mark roughly on them where these beautiful little stems sit. So they have a curve to it. Has a little bit of a curve. You can actually see the round end where it would have been connected to the tree. It's narrow in the center and it's slightly wider again where it meets the pear. And see how I've put it on top of the pear? I haven't stuck it off the edge of the pear. I've actually made sure that it is like within the outline of the pear. So it's not just a random little stem sticking out the side of the fruit. It is actually a stem that is attached to the center of the fruit. So this particular pear over the back here has a little bit of a curved area, which is the flesh itself, and the stem is coming up from behind it. So I put that little mark in first. Again, not as pronounced as the first one, but you still can see a tiny touch of the end where it would have been attached to the tree. Again, it's slightly wider on that end, gets a little bit narrower in the middle and shoots back out at the bottom again. And then the third one over here, which is actually on the front side of our view or our perspective. So you can see a bit of a rounded area, a little bit of a bobble in the flesh of the fruit. You can see a little bit of a rounded edge where the actual stem is coming out of the pear. Then this one, because it's a little bit chunkier, it's got a little knobbly bit. And again, I can see a little bit of that top edge on it. And fruit is an organic shape. So you don't want to just draw two lines and go, okay, that's it, that's my stem done. There's so many little angles and interesting curves in these little details, and those are the details of the drawing that'll actually make it really believable. You can simplify things as much as you like, and while you're first starting and getting going with it, by all means, just pick the simple shapes and the simple options. But as the further you progress with it, the more you want to look and the harder you want to look for little detail. Now, I'm not going to put the speckles into these pears for today's exercise. I'm just going to do the general shading rule. However, if you wanted to, you could sit and put all the little marks in the skin and then shade over the top. So underneath this pear, in this little divot, I can see quite a dark little shadow being cast. And the shadow, because as I said earlier, the light is slightly offset, the shadow is falling out to the left. And there's actually a shadow for that stem. This particular shadow in the center. And then this little shadow, they do not touch, those two shadows don't touch. So it's really important to look at, okay, where does this line start and finish? And then the rest of the picture, or the rest of the image that I'm trying to convey, does that line touch that? Does that line intersect? Does that line run next to? How far apart would they be? Like these pears and the pears I'm working off are very similar in size. So I can literally look that there's about 0.5 centimetre, give or take, between those two shadow lines. So I'm going to draw it that size. I don't want to make it too big or too small. Okay, so there's no other stem shadows available. The only stem shadow is this one here over to our left. So the other two are literally just shadows sitting on the table. So now what I'm going to do, I like to work dark to light. Now the reason I do that is because I use the paper stump that I talked about before to actually transfer the dark lead that I've already put on in some spots across to the lighter side of the shape or the image. And what that does is it avoids all those little scratchy pencil lines that you sometimes see in your drawing. So what I'm going to do is come in under this side of the pear. Now where the pear meets the shadow is obviously where it would be darkest. And I tend to fill my shadow areas or my darker shading spaces with rounded pencil strokes. Like I'm not just going back and forth in a zigzag fashion. I'm actually just drawing little circles, one on top of each other, because it gets rid of any of those harsh lines that are really hard to remove later. If you put one really dark stroke of a line somewhere and it's too hard, A, it's really difficult to rub it out, and B, it will ruin your drawing in the overall composition and the look of it. So underneath the pear there is where it would be darkest. And the further away, it doesn't get heaps lighter, but it does get a little bit lighter. So I'll pop this pencil out a touch further. And then I would use my paper stump, which you can see that this end is already dirty, and this end is cleaner because I ran it through my sharpener. And if I rub that over the lead, see how it's just smoothing it out and kind of making it more hazy. Now, if you want to take up drawing and you don't have a paper stump and you want to give it a crack and give it a go, I haven't tried it, but I would imagine a cotton tip, like a cotton bud, would do a similar thing. It might go a bit fluffy and it might not stand up to the friction of rubbing with the lead as much, but if you've got a whole packet of cotton tips, no problem. You can just use as many as you need. So have an experiment. If you don't quite have the exact materials at home, have a bit of an experiment and see what you could find that might do the job and might work. So that's my shadow on my first pear. Now what I'm going to go looking for now, again, I'm working on the darkest sections because I like putting the darks in first. That stem casts a shadow on the pear itself up here. So from beside the stem to the edge of the pear, I'm going to put a dark little shadow in. And what else I can see is running down the left hand side of the pear is quite a bit darker, And the light source, because the light's coming from this way, the light source actually runs across the side here. So what I might do is not as heavily as what I've just drawn in with the shadow, but heavy enough so that I get an edge to my pear. And I want it reasonably defined. I don't want it too hazy. And then I just lay my pencil down on its side a little bit more. There's a section through here that I can see hosts a bit more of a shadow. And down the bottom where it meets its shadow, there is a little bit of a darker patch, but you don't want it quite as dark as the shadow. And similarly, there's a bit of a section through the side up here. And notice I'm kind of putting my areas in a curved fashion, so I'm not working against the shape of the pear. So I'm working with the curves of the pear and where those darker sections might be sitting. And even without smudging any of that or playing with any of those smudging sticks, you can kind of start to get the feel of how that pear sits and exists. Now I'm just going to take away my little messy double line because I drew it once and decided it wasn't quite that big. So again, back to my trusty paper stump. I'm going to gently rub over, and then I'm going to transfer that grey of the pencil into the sections where I haven't put any pencil. And you can see that that's giving a really beautiful shade and coverage of the pear, but I actually haven't used the pencil and I haven't put any pencil marks or lines there, because I'm actually just going to use the lead that picks up on the paper stump. As I rub over this area here, obviously that section there will be a little bit darker because the lead is already sitting there. And again, I'm changing the direction of which I use my paper stump. I am still working the paper stump in small circles because the last thing I want is big zigzaggy lines sitting across my fruit. And by working it in circles, it picks up I find it picks up the lead particles smoother. Now remembering that our light source is coming from the top, but it's not hitting the side, it's hitting the section that's kind of closest to me. So I'll just finish this little shadow section up here and get nice and light. So what I want to do is work now down this other side so that the top side is always lighter, but on that particular edge there's still a little bit of colour. And then the section through the side, through the middle, well, a third of the way across maybe, is where it's going to be the lightest. And through this section here, it's just a mid-tone, so I'm going to fill. And if I need a bit more colour, I just rub back over that lead section where I was working. Okay, so that's my pear shape sitting there for now. What I'm now going to do, I've already got a bit of a dark line sitting in there from when I drew that stem in originally. I'm going to fill the section at the top, make it nice and dark because it's a nice little dark edge. And I'm going to pop a couple of little imperfections into that stem because it's not perfectly smooth. And I'm going to leave the right hand side of the stem with a little bit more of a light source hitting it because that's the direction the light's coming from. So then I can go back in and I can just neaten up. I want that edge there nice and sharp where that creates a definite shadow across the edge of my pear. Down the bottom here, I want a little bit more definition to the base of the pear in amongst that shadow area. So I can just come back in now with my pencil and sharpen. Still, smudge stick, take away those hard edges of the pencil lines so that it all has that really nice smooth finish to it. And if I go, you know what, I think I need that little bit of a light source up here to be slightly brighter, I can come back in with my eraser and I can rub that little bit of graphite out so that I've got a nice bright shiny section where the light source would be hitting. Might put an extra couple little bits down that side. So you can always take pencil back off, obviously. It's always a lovely little forgiving medium to practice with, because if you make a mistake, you can rub it out. I want to smudge a touch so that that stem matches the rest. I'm just gonna connect it just a little bit more at the bottom there. Okay, so that's pair number 1. I'm going to pop on fast time motion now so that we're not sitting here all afternoon. I have to go get my little girl. But what I'll do is put it on fast time motion. I'll finish these other 2 pairs and then I'll come back at the end and I'll show you what it looks like and how it's finished. All right, I'll see you soon. So here are my pairs, all nice and finished. And again, let's get both pairs and paper in shot and roughly from the angle that I was looking at. So you can see that that pair on the left casts a shadow where it meets the pair in the center. Again, I grabbed this darker lead rather, and I just emphasized that little shadow in there. I could even take it down a touch further if I wanted to. And again, I just soften it. And again, I can grab my paper stump and just soften where it meets the rest of the color. And that dark shadow on that pair projects that left-hand pair forward. So it's really important to look for light sources, but it's also really important to look for your shadows. Now, the difference between these pairs, and you can see on the one over here, is that the pair on the right has a darker coloring to it. So it's actually darker than the pair behind it. So that's why that little light gap shows that that pair is different. Now, if you're troubleshooting an image and you haven't quite got it how you want it, or it's not quite looking right, go back to the shape and see if you've got the shapes the right kind of distance and proportion. But a lot of the time, if something's not quite looking right, I tend to find that people just haven't got their light sources light enough or their shadows dark enough. So be brave, put a bit of darker color on there. Worst case scenario, you grab another pencil, grab a different type of fruit and try again. But at the end of the day, drawing comes down to practice, practice, practice. It is a skill that you learn and you get better at as you go. I've been doing it now for 20 years, so I find picking up a pencil pretty comfortable, but some people that are new at it obviously find it a little bit more daunting. So I'll leave you here for now. Have a great rest of the day, and I will be in touch with the next video. See you later.